And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio. I'm joined by Professor Dan Malleck, talking all things alcohol, the CCSA's new report that you are likely a problematic drinker if you have more than 2 per week, and some of the science and data behind it or lack thereof. But I wanted to pick your brain because we as a country, generally speaking, have had a very progressive approach to harm reduction. That seems certainly true the further west you go. If you end up in BC, we talk about safe injection sites and trying to ensure that addicts don't die, and safe supply and testing and all of those things, while at the same time really harboring like a temperance prohibition style approach to alcohol. Is my assessment accurate? Is there some hypocrisy there? And if so, why?
Yeah, there's definitely some kind of cognitive dissonance, right? Probably the same thing as hypocrisy in that we've seen the danger of prohibition of drugs. We've seen the negative effects. I mean, harm reduction is all about not about stopping people from taking drugs, but about reducing the harms associated with the prohibited drugs, right? People using needles, people not being able to speak to their doctor about it, all of that stuff. Like, it's a lot of stuff, and I'm not minimizing it by any means. Whereas alcohol, because the prohibition was 100 years ago, and people sort of look at it as this time of speakeasies and flappers and all of that stuff. But there was a lot of problems with that, like people drinking rubbing alcohol and people drinking what's called canned heat, like that gelled alcohol you use for camping and stuff like that. They seem to forget that there was harm in that, and they seem to forget that prohibition causes harm. Now, the CCSA claims it's not advocating prohibition, but one of the things that's happening, and I've seen this happen, I've talked to alcoholics who do not like this report because of the stigma it creates, because they understand stigma around alcohol, and it's creating the stigma where if you're known to be drinking 7 drinks a week, you're clearly an irresponsible person because you're damaging your health and you're increasing your risk and all of this stuff, right? So that, and I'm putting that in quotes because I don't believe that, but that's where stigma comes from. It's about reframing our relationship with alcohol to something that is only problematic. And so if you're a drinker, you're clearly doing something irresponsible, and that's stigma. That's building stigma, and it's great strategy if you're temperance oriented, because you're trying to scare people into behaving the way you want them to behave. But it's probably not the healthiest approach if you're looking at people being healthy. Problem is the CCSA, a lot of their other stuff on, say, when they gave they did a policy brief to the cannabis commission as they were coming up with the best way to deal with legalization, and a lot of their stuff was very much came from this, what I call a problem framework, which is you see something as a problem, and all you're doing is trying to limit the knock-on problems as well, right? So they only talked about children smoking cannabis, and they talked about mental illness and cannabis and all of these things that have some connection but not as necessary. I mean, children smoking cannabis can be a problem, but have some connection, but not as dire or strong connection as they suggest. And then they're saying, you have to be as restrictive as possible. And I'll admit that I advocated for a model that followed the liquor control model, because as someone who studied liquor control after Prohibition, I saw that was the way the government managed the opposition, like reintroduced liquor as a legal substance. By managing the opposition, by trying to eliminate all of the things that would cause the opposition to it to go, oh, look, see, we said this was going to happen.
To make it politically viable. To
make it politically viable and reduce the opposition. And that's, anyway, so we've gone into cannabis.
No. I mean, that's a very good point. I want to ask you a question, because it strikes me as rather strange when government-funded organizations obviously get taxpayer money and then lobby the government for policy change, because in some sense it feels like the government paying to lobby itself. And it kind of, I think it was Dr. Sylvain Chalbois out at Dalhousie was like, well, why have Health Canada then? Like, if we're going to pay for research from organizations who have a clear, I think he said, imagine we paid PETA to give us a report on meat consumption, what's the conclusion going to be? Well, we all know what it's going to be because we know what they believe. Is this common? Is this common? Is it maybe as nefarious as I think it is? Are there some ethical questions there, or is this not a nothing burger and something we should leave?
No, I think that that is a valid criticism, and I think Sylvain Sauga has some really good points there. I have on my wall something I was given in grade 11 history class that I use all the time, and it says, an idea becomes a movement becomes an organization becomes an institution, and therein lies the death of the idea, right? It's how the more you create this bureaucracy, and we were talking about like the church and other things, right, in school, but the more you make someone's job and work about maintaining that institution, the less they're focused on their goals, right? So, and let's not talk about Health Canada. What Health Canada does, because Health Canada is a government agency that funds research. They provide money to researchers who have cred, and they expect research that is balanced and can inform policy, right? And what they did here was they gave money to the CCSA to update these guidelines, but the CCSA went way beyond what they were mandated to do. And there's been a lot of international opposition and voices against what the CCSA has done, because they said, we're updating the guidelines, but the guidelines from 2011 had nothing about policy change, about labeling, about limiting access to alcohol, all of those sort of prohibitionist oriented things. So I don't think it's not a nothing burger. It's definitely a valid concern, and I'm pretty sure that within Health Canada there are concerns about this report as well, because they see the overreach. They're not stupid. There was no peer review on this report. People have emailed me and said, was there peer review on this? I said, no, it's a report. It's not an academic journal article, right? But and they trust the integrity of the organization to do their own kind of reviewing. And I think what's happened is the CCSA has kind of maybe shot itself in the foot a bit, because their credibility is at stake here. And unfortunately, it's also the credibility of other health information organizations that might not ever engage in this sort of ideological approach to advice giving.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that. I woke up to, I'm on a mailing list from an economist in the U.S., Emily Oster, who does predominantly parent data and studies, breaking down myths and facts and things like that. I'm a new parent, so I find all of that very interesting. But even she dug into the CCSA's report, and her conclusion was, not so fast. And I mean, she's not Canadian, doesn't do business in Canada, just completely on the outside. And we're starting to see other news outlets discredit the report and the organization. On the consumer side, I think part of my concern is that the guidelines are so divorced from reality that they become a joke, in a sense, where the guidelines that are supposed to exist to guide healthy living are now so low that nobody really cares. They don't. There was a video, I think it was City News, and they interviewed a guy, a rather hilarious guy, and it went viral on Twitter, and he was like, 2 beers? Come on. You're going to tell me I can't have more than 2 beers at home? Do you think that could be a negative externality here, where the guidelines are so low that people just stop taking the guidelines in their totality seriously?
Yeah, I think there's a really big risk of that. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, there are international standards on giving sort of advice to the public. I mean, one of the things that they talk about is, having an informed populace know what they're doing. But then the guidelines themselves are ridiculous, and the way they present evidence is really impenetrable. Like I'm a scholar, it's kind of my job, and I'm reading it going, I have no idea what's going on. And I talk to epidemiologists who look at it and go, I don't recognize the way they're using that as, maybe it's valid in their field, right? So there's a lot of kind of muddiness to it. But then as well, there are, like I said, there's international standards on providing information. So for example, you don't provide relative risk information. You provide actual risk, right? So this whole percentage likelihood of increasing, it doesn't make sense to people. And the concern from these different international researchers and commentators, and they're not necessarily commenting on the CCSA's report, but just in general on how this is done, is that when you do that, you erode respect or the reputation of these organizations. So just as you said, I can see people going, well, I mean, this recommendation is ridiculous. Why am I even going to listen to the 10 to 15 drinks a week? Right.
Yeah, they throw the baby out.
A lot.
Yeah, they throw the baby out with the bathwater and just disregard the concept of guidelines. It's interesting you bring up the risk side of things, because some have pointed out, and I think you're included, right? If let's say 14 drinks a week, the figure of increases your risk of a particular cancer by 100%, that's not necessarily useful information without the add-on of going from 0.001 to 0.002, because that actually allows for people to make informed decisions, and we see these figures come out quite frequently in response to the report. Do you think that type of communication would be better for consumers and people who are wanting to make healthier decisions?
I think so. I think the challenge, though, is that so I think so, but the problem with things like cancer, I mean, there's lots of problems with cancer, and I'm, like many people, have had cancer. People in my life die of cancer, so I don't take it seriously. Is that people have a lot of different risk factors. There's a lot of things. Breast cancer is one of those ones that there's a ton of risk factors, and it's the highest incidence cancer that they list. So to say you can get this or that cancer from drinking doesn't really say anything, because there's a lot of other things that you might have a very low risk. You can't just say a woman has X percentage chance of getting cancer, because some women have more, or breast cancer, some women have more, some women have less. Different physiological, genetic, all of these different factors come into it, right? So yes, the relative risk thing is a big issue. If you have 0.5% chance of getting something, and that increases by 100%, then you have 1% chance, right? Like that's 100% increase. It's kind of a dodge the pharmaceutical companies use sometimes, saying this drug will reduce this condition by 50% when you might not have a high likelihood of getting it, and it's seen as discreditable in that field, but apparently in this field it's absolutely fine. But it's not. Like, as I said, the international standards generally recommend don't use relative risk. And then, like I said, cancer and these other conditions actually have other factors that go into it besides alcohol. So to make a direct connection with alcohol, you're missing a lot. And the other thing about risk is that alcohol is not consumed in a vacuum. So if you're looking at a study that covers people over the last 40 years, you're talking about people who were drinking most likely in bars or restaurants where there was smoking and where they were eating and all of that stuff that is not considered in that, right? So it's just a lot of distortion for a specific end. And what they're saying is not recognizing the nuances of it. Right at the end of their report, they have some what are called limitations to their study, which most good researchers do. And if you read those limitations first, you would just throw out the study, because it basically says there's so many ways that this is not accurate. And yet they're not afraid to make these big, bold recommendations and guidelines.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we'll leave it at that. Professor, it has been a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for enlightening not only myself and our listeners. This is certainly a hot topic that we're going to keep following, and hopefully have you back on the program to see how this develops.